He expected a black-edged letter announcing her death. He had, after all, purchased a dying woman, a convenient, temporary duchess to satisfy the crown's irritating preoccupation with his ducal line. He had installed her in his most remote, most ruinous estate, a place known for its damp and its ghosts, and left her there as one might leave a faulty timepiece in a disused drawer. He did not expect, upon his return 2 years later, shattered by political defeat and seeking only a quiet grave, to find the gates repaired, the fields tilled, and smoke curling from the chimneys like a defiant flag. He did not expect to find the woman he had sent to die not only alive, but magnificent, ruling his forgotten corner of the world with an iron will and ink-stained fingers. He certainly did not expect that in the heart of that reclaimed ruin, she had not just built a home, but had forged a place for his own haunted soul to finally rest. The solicitor's office was a room bleached of all color and warmth. Dust motes danced in the thin, gray light slanting from a tall, grimy window, each one a tiny ghost in the stale air. The only sounds were the scratching of a nib on parchment, the funereal tick of a large clock on the mantelpiece, and the dry, rasping cough that Alara Vance was trying, and failing, to suppress into a linen handkerchief. It was a pathetic sound, she knew, the sound of weakness, the sound of a poor bargain. Alastair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the middle distance, his mind clearly 1,000 miles away, in the smoke-filled chambers of Parliament or the mud-choked fields of the continent where he had spent the better part of a decade fighting the King's wars. He was a man carved from granite and winter frost, his imposing frame seeming to absorb what little light and air the room possessed. His face, handsome in a severe, angular way, was a mask of bored indifference. He was here to perform a duty, a tedious but necessary transaction, and he was enduring it with the same stoicism he might employ for a tooth extraction. The terms are agreed. Your Grace, the solicitor, a man named Finch with a face like a worried vole, murmured, blotting the final signature. Miss Vance understands her obligations, and the settlement upon her aunt is prepared. Beside Alara, her Aunt Constance shifted, the silk of her gown rustling with avarice. She had been weeping earlier, dabbing at her dry eyes, and speaking of her profound love for her unfortunate, sickly niece. Now, the performance was over. Her eyes were sharp and focused on the purse that Finch had discreetly placed at the edge of the great mahogany desk. That purse was Alara's price. The cost of a ducal title for a few months, perhaps a year, long enough to quiet the whispers about the Blackwood succession before she conveniently and tidily expired. She will be a duchess, Constance said, her voice laced with a triumphant reverence that made Alara's stomach clench. The Duchess of Blackwood. Alastair's gaze flickered, for the first time, toward Alara. It was not a look of assessment or curiosity. It was the look a man gives a piece of furniture he has been forced to acquire. He took in her pallor, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her worn gray dress hung from her slender frame. He registered the cough, which she was again trying to smother. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were utterly devoid of pity. They held only a flat, pragmatic emptiness. He was not buying a bride. He was buying a solution to a problem. Her impending death was not a tragedy. It was a feature of the purchase. She will, he agreed, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was a voice accustomed to command, to being obeyed without question. It was not a voice for tenderness or comfort. He stood, his height dominating the small room. The carriage is waiting. We will depart for Blackwood Manor at once. There was no question, no polite inquiry. It was a statement of fact, a dismissal. Aunt Constance practically vibrated with eagerness to be rid of her, to be left alone with her 30 pieces of silver. She fluttered a hand toward Alara. Be a good girl, dear. Do as His Grace commands. Alara stood on unsteady legs. The room swam for a moment, the gray light turning to black at the edges. She had not eaten. The knot of dread in her stomach had made it impossible. She placed a hand on the back of her chair to steady herself, her knuckles white. She met the Duke's cold gaze, and for a single, defiant second, she did not look away. In her lucid green eyes, a spark of something not yet extinguished, pride, perhaps, or sheer, bloody-minded will, flared and died. She was a survivor. She had survived a childhood of poverty, the loss of her parents, the cloying charity of her aunt. She would survive this, for however long she had left. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a piece of luggage that had been confirmed as loaded. Then he turned and strode from the room without a backward glance. The sound of his boots on the floorboards was heavy, final. Alara did not say goodbye to her aunt. There was nothing to say. She followed the echo of the Duke's footsteps out of the sterile office and into the cold, damp London air, her only possession a small, worn valise containing 2 dresses and a book of herbal remedies. She was the Duchess of Blackwood now, a title that felt like a shroud. The journey north was a study in silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that filled the vast, well-sprung carriage and seemed to press in on Alara from all sides. The Duke sat opposite her, a formidable shadow in the gloom. He had not spoken a single word to her since they had left the solicitor's office. He did not read. He did not look out the window at the passing landscape, which dissolved from the grimy brick of London into a blur of sodden green fields and skeletal winter trees. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on some internal horizon that was, Alara suspected, far bleaker than the one outside. She watched him from beneath her lashes, a furtive study of the man who now owned her. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, but he was worn in a way that had nothing to do with years. There were fine lines etched around his eyes and a faint, silvery scar that traced a path from his left temple into his dark hair. A dueling scar? A war wound? It spoke of a life of action and violence that was utterly alien to her. He was a creature of power and politics, of steel and strategy. And she was a cough, a liability, a ghost in waiting. The rain began an hour out of the city, a miserable, persistent drizzle that quickly thickened into a downpour. It lashed against the carriage windows, streaking the glass and obscuring the world, trapping them in their own hermetically sealed bubble of quiet misery. The air inside grew cold, thick with the damp scent of wet wool and old leather. Alara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the chill seeping into her bones, aggravating the ache in her lungs. She fought the urge to cough, pressing her lips together, knowing the sound would be an unwelcome intrusion into his monumental stillness. He seemed entirely unaffected by the cold, a man who lived in a perpetual winter, she thought. He did not shiver. He did not stir. He was as still and silent as a statue in a forgotten churchyard. His detachment was so complete, it was almost a physical force. It was a wall, thick and high and unbreachable. He was not ignoring her. He was simply not aware of her in any meaningful way. She was cargo. They stopped twice. Once at a coaching inn where a footman brought trays to the carriage. The Duke ate a plate of cold meat and bread with mechanical efficiency. Alara managed only a few sips of weak, lukewarm tea, the food sticking in her throat. The second time was to change the horses, a frantic, rain-soaked affair of shouting men and stamping hooves, glimpsed through the fogged-up glass. Through it all, the Duke remained impassive, a monolith of indifference. As the second day bled into a bruised purple evening, the landscape changed. The rolling fields gave way to wild, untamed moorland, vast and empty under a sky the color of slate. The road worsened, becoming a rutted track that jolted the carriage and made Alara's teeth ache. The rain had not ceased. It fell with a grim, relentless determination, turning the world to mud and misery. A sense of profound isolation began to creep over her. They were leaving the world behind. Finally, the carriage slowed, turning off the main track onto a path even more neglected. Gnarled, ancient trees, heavy with moss, loomed over them, their branches clawing at the carriage roof. Through the gloom, Alara saw a pair of immense stone gateposts, one of which leaned at a drunken angle, its iron gate half-wrenched from its hinges and choked with ivy. A crow sat atop the other, a black smudge against the gray sky, and let out a harsh, grating cry as they passed. This was Blackwood Manor. The drive was long and winding. Alara peered out the window, trying to catch a glimpse of the house, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. And then she saw it. It was not a house. It was a tomb, a vast, sprawling edifice of dark, weeping stone, more fortress than home. Dozens of windows stared out like vacant eyes, most of them dark, some boarded over. A whole wing of the building seemed to have collapsed in on itself, a jagged silhouette of ruined gables and broken chimneys against the stormy sky. Ivy consumed the walls, its thick, hairy tendrils creeping over the sills and around the mullions, as if the wild earth were trying to drag the house back into itself. It was a place that had given up, a place that was actively rotting. The carriage shuddered to a halt before a massive, oak front door, its wood gray and splintered. There was no welcoming light, no servants rushing out to greet their master. There was only the sound of the rain and the sighing of the wind through the broken crenellations. The footman opened the door, and the cold, damp air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and decay. The Duke stirred at last. He rose and stepped out of the carriage without a word, his boots sinking into the gravel and mud of the drive. He did not offer Alara a hand. He did not look back to see if she followed. Alara gathered her resolve and her small valise and descended the carriage steps. The rain hit her immediately, cold and shocking. It plastered her thin dress to her skin and soaked her hair in seconds. She stood there, shivering in the mud, looking up at the monstrous, derelict house that was to be her home and her grave. The great oak door creaked open, spilling a sliver of weak, flickering candlelight into the oppressive gloom. An old woman stood there, holding a single candle. She was tall and severe, dressed in rusty black, her face a roadmap of disapproval. This, Alara presumed, was the welcoming party. The Duke strode past the woman and into the hall without breaking stride. "Gable," he said, his voice flat, "prepare my horse. I ride for London within the hour." The woman, Gable, dipped her head in a curt, resentful curtsy. "Your Grace, the hour is late. The roads are a quagmire." "I'm aware," he clipped, already shrugging out of his wet greatcoat and letting it fall to the flagstone floor with a sodden slap. He paid it no more mind. He paid Alara no mind at all, standing dripping and shivering in the doorway. "See to it." He turned then, and his eyes fell upon Alara. It was as if he had forgotten she was there and was faintly annoyed by the reminder. He looked at her, drenched and pale in the meager candlelight, a pathetic figure against the backdrop of the storm. He looked at the house, a monument to his own neglect. His expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened. This place and this woman were two sides of the same tiresome coin, two duties he wished to be rid of. He took a step towards her. For a wild, irrational moment, she thought he might say something, offer a word of instruction, or even, impossibly, of comfort. He did not. He simply looked down at her, his face a cold, unreadable mask in the flickering light. "You have your title," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying the brutal weight of command. "And you have your house. The staff will see to your needs." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her frail form with clinical detachment. "Do try to be discreet about it. Discreet about it." The words hung in the air between them, cold and sharp as shards of ice. He met her dying. He was instructing her to die quietly, to not be a bother. Humiliation, hot and swift, washed over her, a stark contrast to the chill of the rain. It was worse than his indifference. It was a calculated, deliberate cruelty, in order to cease to exist. She lifted her chin. The water ran from her hair down her face like tears, but her eyes were dry and burning. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She would not. "I will endeavor not to inconvenience you, Your Grace," she said, her own voice tight but clear, each word a tiny, polished stone of defiance. A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed his features. He had expected silence, or tears, or a meek submission. He had not expected this sliver of steel, but it was fleeting. He gave another of his curt, dismissive nods, turned on his heel, and strode away down the vast, echoing hall, his footsteps swallowed by the shadows. He did not look back. Alara stood alone in the rain, the hostile housekeeper watching her from the doorway with cold, assessing eyes. The carriage rumbled away, its wheels churning the mud. The Duke was gone. He had brought her to this tomb and locked the door behind him. She was utterly, completely alone. She looked from the hostile face of the servant to the hostile face of the house, and a wave of despair so profound it was nauseating washed over her. He had left her to die, and in this cold, wet, rotting place it felt as if she surely would. Mrs. Gable led her into the house. The inside was no better than the exterior. The vast entrance hall was a cavern of cold shadows, the air thick with the smell of damp stone, mildew, and the dead, powdery scent of cold ash. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness, its banister thick with dust. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her with silent condemnation. Every surface was filmed with neglect. The place was not sleeping, it was decomposing. "The Duke has designated the East Wing for your use," Mrs. Gable announced, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. The words were laced with a clear, resentful implication. This small, designated corner was all she was entitled to. The rest of this cavernous ruin was not her concern. She led Alara up the grand staircase, their single candle doing little to push back the oppressive dark. Their footsteps echoed unervingly in the silence. Alara's wet dress dripped onto the dusty floorboards, leaving a trail of dark spots. She was a snail, sliming her way through this mausoleum. The room she was shown to was large, with a high, ornate ceiling from which plaster was peeling in long strips. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, its hangings of faded, moth-eaten brocade. The furniture was shrouded in dust sheets, looking like a gathering of ghosts. A miserable fire smoldered in the grate, producing more smoke than heat, the acrid smell stinging Alara's eyes and throat, instantly triggering a racking cough that bent her double. Mrs. Gable watched, her expression unchanging. It was a look of grim satisfaction, the look of someone whose direst, most hoped-for predictions were coming true. "I will send one of the girls with a hot brick for the bed," she said, without a trace of sympathy. "Supper is broth. If you have the strength for it." She turned and left, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click, plunging Alara into near-total darkness, save for the sullen red eye of the fire. For days, Alara drifted in a fugue of illness and despair. The dampness of the house settled deep in her lungs, a cold, heavy weight that made every breath a labor. The room was a prison. The wind howled through ill-fitting window frames, a constant, mournful keen. The rain was relentless. The bed was a landscape of cold, clammy sheets, the single hot brick a small, fleeting island of warmth that was always gone by morning. A sullen, silent girl named Mary brought her trays of thin, flavorless broth and stale bread, which Alara rarely had the appetite to touch. Mrs. Gable appeared once a day, standing in the doorway like a specter of doom, her presence a silent question. "Are you dead yet?" Alara felt herself shrinking, fading. The house was consuming her, leaching the life and warmth from her body, just as it was crumbling into the damp earth. The Duke's parting words echoed in her mind. "Be quietly." It was a command she felt powerless to disobey. The will to fight, that small, hard kernel of defiance she had clung to for so long, was dissolving in the face of such overwhelming misery. The world had shrunk to this cold, dark room, to the sound of the rain and the rattling of her own breath. This was the end. This was the grave he had bought for her. One morning, she awoke to a sliver of watery sunlight piercing the grime on the window pane. It was the first sun she had seen since her arrival. It illuminated a column of dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, swirling galaxy of neglect. And in that weak, pale light, something shifted in Alara's mind. She looked at her hands, resting on the gray, threadbare coverlet. They were so thin, the skin almost translucent over the blue veins. The hands of an invalid. The hands of a dying woman. She thought of her aunt, counting her coins in a warm London drawing room. She thought of the Duke, striding through the halls of power, having already forgotten her existence. They had written her off. They had buried her alive. A surge of anger, white-hot and pure, coursed through her. It was a feeling so powerful it was almost painful, a stark contrast to the cold lethargy that had held her captive. It burned away the fog of despair. No, she would not die in this bed. She would not die in this room. She would not die quietly to suit their convenience. If she was to die, she would die on her feet. She would die living. The door opened, and the girl, Mary, entered with the usual tray. She set it down on the bedside table without a word. Elara pushed herself up, her arms trembling with the effort. "Mary," she said. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, but it held a new, unfamiliar note of command. The girl startled, her eyes wide. It was the first time the Duchess had addressed her by name. "I will not be taking my meals in this bed any longer," Elara stated, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Move my things to a room on the south side of this wing, one that gets the sun, and I want a proper fire built, a fire that gives off heat, not just smoke." Mary stared at her, dumbfounded. "Now, Mary," Elara said, her gaze steady and unyielding. The girl scurried from the room. Minutes later, Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway, her face a thundercloud of outrage. "What is the meaning of this? You are in no condition to be moved." The Duke's instructions were. "The Duke is not here." Elara cut her off, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the icy floorboards, and she flinched, but she did not retreat. I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and this is my house. You will have me moved to a room with sunlight, and you will see to it that a proper fire is laid, or you will find yourself seeking a new position. Is that understood?" The housekeeper was momentarily stunned into silence. She saw not a frail, dying girl, but a woman with fire in her eyes, a woman who looked, for all her pallor and thinness, dangerously formidable. She saw the glint of the ducal ring on Elara's finger, a ring she had not worn until this moment, having slipped it from her valise. It was a symbol, yes, but it was also a weapon. Mrs. Gable, a creature who understood power and its hierarchies, recognized the shift. The balance had changed. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, her voice stiff with resentment. But she said it. It was a victory, a small one, but it was everything. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a new life. Elara stood, swaying but upright, in the middle of the cold, dark room. The fight was not over. It had just begun. The new room was smaller, but the large south-facing window, once scrubbed clean by a resentful Mary, flooded the space with light. A roaring fire, built under Elara's direct and uncompromising supervision, crackled in the hearth, chasing the damp from the air and painting the walls with a warm, flickering glow. It was a beachhead, a small pocket of warmth and life carved out of the vast, decaying mass of the house. For the first week, this room was her entire world. She spent her days in a chair by the fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket she had discovered in a dusty chest, slowly regaining her strength. She ate every spoonful of the now thicker broth, every crumb of the fresher bread she had demanded. She slept, not the fevered, restless sleep of the sick, but a deep, healing slumber lulled by the crackle of the fire. She was still weak, still pale, but the cough that had plagued her began to subside, the ache in her lungs easing. The house was still trying to kill her, but she was finally fighting back. Her first foray beyond her room was a slow, deliberate tour of the East Wing. It was a journey through a world of dust and silence. She pushed open doors to reveal rooms frozen in time, furniture shrouded in white cloths like a congregation of specters. Tapestries, thick with the smell of mildew, depicted faded hunting scenes. In a small, forgotten library, books rotted on the shelves, their leather bindings cracked, and their pages warped by the damp. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and decay. It was overwhelming. The sheer scale of the neglect was staggering. A lesser person would have retreated, defeated by the enormity of the task. But Alara was not a lesser person. She was a pragmatist. She looked at the ruin not with despair, but with a cold, calculating eye. She was not a grand lady come to restore a stately home. She was a survivor, assessing a wreck for salvageable parts. Her first major decision was one of brutal practicality. She summoned Mrs. Gable and the only other permanent indoor staff, the two young maids Mary and Jane, and a stooped, elderly man named Arthur, who served as a general footman and porter. "We are closing it down," Alara announced, standing in the middle of the dusty, echoing gallery. "All of it. This entire wing, except for the 4 rooms we now occupy, and the north wing, and the west. We will live in the central block, above the kitchens. It will be warmer and more manageable." Mrs. Gable looked aghast. "But, Your Grace, the staterooms. The Duke's family history." "The Duke's family history is molding," Alara said flatly. "We cannot heat this entire mausoleum. We cannot clean it. We are pouring our resources, our firewood, our time, our very warmth, into empty, decaying rooms. It is a foolish waste," she pointed. "Arthur, you will help me. We will board up the doors to the outer wings. We will consolidate. We will survive in a corner of this place, and we will let the rest of it sleep." It was an act of strategic retreat, a military decision. Cede the indefensible territory to secure the vital ground. For the next week, she and Arthur, with grudging help from the maids, worked. They stripped the abandoned rooms of anything useful: blankets, serviceable furniture, firewood, candles. They dragged heavy dressers and wardrobes across floors to barricade the doors to the unused wings, creating a physical barrier against the damp and the drafts. The house groaned and protested, but Alara was relentless. She was shrinking her world to a size she could control. Her next target was the heart of the house, the kitchens. They were a vast, cavernous space, but unlike the rest of the manor, they were functional. A huge, cast-iron range stood cold and silent, and a well-used bake-oven sat beside it. But the larder was nearly bare. A few sacks of flour, some shriveled potatoes, and salted meat. They were living on the dregs. "What do we eat?" she asked Mrs. Gable, running a hand over a dusty, empty shelf. "What the tenants provide, Your Grace. A portion of their crop, as is the due. It is not much. The land is poor. And the ledgers? The household accounts." Mrs. Gable produced a stack of leather-bound books, their pages filled with a spidery, sloping script. Alara spent the next 3 days at the massive kitchen table, a shawl around her shoulders and a candle burning late into the night, poring over them. It was a grim litany of mismanagement and decay. Vast sums spent on wine for a cellar no one used. Payments to ghost staff who had left or died years ago. Bills for repairs that had clearly never been made. The estate was bleeding money, a slow, steady hemorrhage into nothingness. She found what she was looking for in the oldest ledger: records of the estate's assets. Silverware, paintings, furniture, and, most interestingly, land. Dozens of acres of fallow fields, overgrown pastures, and woodland that were producing nothing. She made another decision. The next morning, she put on a pair of sturdy boots she found in a back closet and a thick wool cloak, and she walked out of the house, not as an invalid, but as a landowner. The air was cold and crisp, the rain having finally given way to a weak but determined sun. The ground was soft and muddy, but the air smelled clean, of wet earth and pine. She walked past the crumbling facade of the house and made for a small, tidy-looking cottage near the edge of the woods. Smoke curled from its chimney. This was the home of Mr. Thorne, the groundsman. She found him splitting logs, the rhythmic thwack of his axe the only sound in the quiet morning. He was a man in his 50s, wiry and weathered, with kind, steady eyes. He stopped when he saw her, wiping his brow with the back of a calloused hand, his expression one of polite surprise. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head. "Mr. Thorne," she began, getting straight to the point. "The household accounts are a disaster. The house is a ruin. We have no food. This cannot continue. He listened, his expression unreadable but attentive. He was one of the few people who had not looked at her with either pity or resentment. He looked at her as if she were simply a person. "I have reviewed the maps," she continued, her breath misting in the cold air. "There are 20 acres of pasture to the south that are completely overgrown with gorse and bracken. The ledger says they were once leased to a sheep farmer from the village." "Aye," Thorne said. "Old man Hemlock. He died 5 years past. His son didn't take it on. Said the Duke's steward wanted too much for it. And the old walled garden behind the west wing. A mess of weeds, your grace. The glass in the greenhouses is all broken. Has been for a decade. But the soil is good. He considered this. The best on the whole estate. Sheltered from the wind. Gets the sun all day. Good," she said, a plan forming, sharp and clear. "We will not be heating the Duke's ancestral halls this winter, Mr. Thorne. We will be eating. You and I are going to start a garden. And you're going to find me a tenant for that pasture. A young farmer, someone with more ambition than sense. Offer him a lease for a pittance for the first 2 years, on the condition he clears the gorse himself. We need the income, however small, and we need life back on this land." Thorne stared at her. He had served the Beaumonts his entire life. He had watched the old Duke, a profligate and a gambler, run the estate into the ground. He had watched the new Duke, the soldier, abandon it completely. He had watched the slow, inexorable decay, feeling as helpless as a man watching a tide come in. And now, this slip of a girl, this pale, sickly creature who looked as if a strong wind could carry her away, was standing in the mud, talking about leases and kitchen gardens with more sense and fire than he had heard in 20 years. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Aye, your grace," he said, and there was a new note in his voice. A note of respect. A note of hope. "I think we can do that." The reclamation of Blackwood began not with a grand gesture, but with the turning of a single spadeful of earth. Alara, bundled in her cloak, stood in the derelict walled garden, a place of tangled briars and skeletal, dead fruit trees, and watched as Thorne drove his spade into the matted ground. The rich, dark soil that he turned over smelled of promise. She could not do the heavy work herself, but she could direct. She had her book of herbal remedies, which also contained detailed chapters on horticulture. She planned the layout with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Here, the hardy winter greens, kale, chard, leeks. There, the root vegetables that would store through the winter, potatoes, carrots, parsnips. She sent Thorne into the village not to buy expensive seeds, but to trade for them. A set of dusty, forgotten silver candlesticks from a boarded-up room bought them enough seed potatoes to plant 1/4 of an acre. Mrs. Gable watched these proceedings with a sour, tight-lipped disapproval. "Farming, your grace, is not fitting for a duchess. Starving is not fitting for anyone, Mrs. Gable," Alara retorted without looking up from her diagrams. "If you would prefer to dine on the Duke's family history, be my guest. I find it rather tough and stringy." The housekeeper sniffed and retreated, but the exchange was overheard by Mary, the young maid, who smothered a giggle. The story, Alara knew, would make its way through the small, insulated world of the staff. Her reputation was changing. She was no longer the tragic, dying duchess. She was becoming something else entirely, odd, formidable, and unexpectedly practical. The work was slow and backbreaking. Thorne was only one man, and Arthur, the old footman, was willing but frail. Yet progress was made. Day by day, a patch of the wild, tangled garden was tamed. Rows of dark, tilled earth began to appear amidst the chaos. Thorne, seeing her genuine commitment, began to unearth old tools from a forgotten shed, sharpening them, mending their handles. He spoke of his father, who had been head gardener in the estate's glory days, and a wealth of forgotten knowledge began to surface. Meanwhile, Alara turned her attention back to the house itself. With the outer wings sealed off, the central part of the manor became more manageable. She directed the maids in a relentless campaign against the dirt and decay. They scrubbed floors, beat carpets until clouds of dust choked the air, and polished furniture that hadn't been touched in a generation. Alara herself, her strength slowly returning, took on the task of the accounts. She set up an office in the small, sunlit room that had been her sick chamber. The fire was always lit. The window was always open to the clean, cold air. She worked with a single-minded focus, the ledger spread before her. She was ruthless. She struck off the phantom staff. She wrote to the wine merchant in London, canceling the Duke's standing order with a curt, unapologetic note. She found a record of a pension being paid to a former steward who had, according to the village vicar Thorne consulted on her behalf, been dead for 3 years. The fraud stopped. The trickle of money she saved was agonizingly small, but it was something. Thorne found a young shepherd willing to take on the lease of the south pasture. The initial rent was, as she had instructed, a pittance, but it was more than nothing. And the sight of his flock grazing on the hillside, their bells a faint, musical tinkling on the wind, was a sign of life that was worth more than the few shillings they brought in. One afternoon, a crisis arrived in the form of a storm. A fierce autumn gale swept in from the moors, rattling the house to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows, and in the middle of the night, a loud crash echoed from above, followed by the steady, ominous drip, drip, drip of water. Alara, in her nightdress and shawl, followed the sound to the main hall. Water was pouring from the ceiling, splashing onto the flagstones. The roof, the great, sprawling, neglected roof, had finally given way. Mrs. Gable stood there, wringing her hands, her usual severity replaced by panic. "We are ruined. The whole house will come down." Alara looked up at the gaping, dripping hole. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. "Get every bucket we have," she ordered. "Arthur, fetch the oilcloths from the stables. We'll rig a channel. We can't stop it, but we can direct it." For the rest of the night, the tiny household worked together in the flickering lantern light. They were a strange, motley crew, a duchess in her nightclothes, a grim housekeeper, a terrified maid, and 2 old men. They placed buckets, mopped floors, and stretched canvases to divert the flow of water away from the main staircase and toward the drain. It was a chaotic, desperate, and soaking wet affair. But as the first gray light of dawn broke, they had contained the worst of it. The hall was a mess of buckets and sodden cloths, but it was not flooded. The staircase was saved. Alara stood, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her head, shivering with cold and exhaustion. She looked at her small, bedraggled team. Mrs. Gable's hair had come undone, and there was a smudge of grime on her cheek. Thorne's face was grim with exhaustion. But they had done it. They had faced a disaster, and together, they had held it at bay. Mrs. Gable looked at Alara, at the water dripping from the hem of her nightdress, at the resolute set of her jaw, and in the housekeeper's stern, unforgiving eyes, something finally broke. A grudging, hard-won respect. "You should get into a dry gown, Your Grace," she said, her voice rough, but for the first time, devoid of its icy edge. "You'll catch your death," she turned to Mary. "Go. Draw a hot bath for Her Grace, and use the good lavender salts from the still room." It was a surrender, an acknowledgement. In the middle of the leaking, storm-battered hall, Alara had not just saved a piece of the house. She had conquered its keeper. From that day on, things were different. Mrs. Gable's opposition melted away, replaced by a gruff, formidable efficiency now directed by Alara. The housekeeper, it turned out, knew the house and its secrets better than anyone. She knew which merchants had cheated the estate for years, which tenants were reliable, and where the old Duke had hidden a small cache of surprisingly good brandy. Her loyalty, once given, was absolute. Winter arrived, blanketing the moors in snow. But inside the central block of Blackwood Manor, it was not the damp, deadly winter Alara had first endured. It was a season of warmth and purpose. The fires burned brightly, fed by the wood Thorne and Arthur had spent the autumn cutting and seasoning. The kitchen, now the undisputed heart of the house, was filled with the sense of baking bread and simmering stews made with the first hearty vegetables from their new garden. Alara had established a routine. Mornings were for the accounts and correspondence. Afternoons were for directing the ongoing, slow-motion repairs of the house or planning the spring planting with Thorn. Evenings were spent by the fire in her small parlor, not alone, but often with Mrs. Gable, the two of them going over inventories or mending linens, a comfortable, productive silence between them. The house was still a ruin. Vast sections of it were still dark and cold and given over to the damp. But the part they inhabited was fiercely alive. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, a home built not on wealth or title, but on sheer, unyielding pragmatism. Section Alara looked at her reflection in the wavy, ancient glass of her window. 2 years had passed since the Duke had left her in the mud. 2 years. The woman looking back at her was not the same one who had arrived. The pallor was gone, replaced by a healthy complexion burnished by wind and a little sun. She was still slender, but no longer fragile. Her eyes, once clouded with despair, were clear and sharp. There were ink stains on her fingers, and, if one looked closely, a trace of honest dirt beneath her nails. She wore a simple, practical dress of dark wool, mended at the elbow. She was not the ethereal, dying duchess. She was the mistress of Blackwood. She had not merely survived. She had taken root and grown. She had not heard a word from her husband. Not a letter, not a message. He paid the small, regular stipend into the bank in the local town as per their agreement, the fund she used to run the estate. But that was it. He was a ghost, a name on a legal document. She had long since stopped thinking about his return. Blackwood was hers now, forged in her image, responsive to her will. This was her life, her kingdom. She needed no one. Alastair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, rode through the rain, his head bowed against the wind. He was not just weary, he was hollowed out. The past 2 years had been a brutal, soul-crushing grind. He had thrown himself back into the political arena, fighting battles in Parliament, shoring up alliances, playing the great, vicious game of power. And he had lost. His faction had been outmaneuvered, his signature bill defeated, his influence shattered. He was returning from London not in triumph, but in disgrace. A pariah. He was exhausted. A deep, profound exhaustion that went bone deep. He was tired of the lies, the betrayals, the endless, grasping ambition of men. He was tired of the noise and the filth of the city. He craved silence. He craved an ending. As he rode north, an image of Blackwood Manor began to form in his mind. The rotting, derelict pile he had inherited and ignored. It seemed a fitting destination, a tomb for a politically dead man. He would go there, to his great, crumbling mausoleum, and simply stop. He remembered, with a vague, detached flicker of memory, the woman he had left there. The pale, coughing girl. She was long dead by now, surely. The damp and the neglect would have seen to that. He felt a brief, clinical pang of something that might have been regret, but was more likely annoyance. He would have to deal with the legalities of it. Another tedious duty. He expected a letter from his solicitor would be waiting for him, tucked away by the sour-faced housekeeper, Gable. The journey was long and punishing, the roads even worse than he remembered. He rode alone, having dismissed his groom. He wanted no company. He wanted only the cold, cleansing misery of the rain and the wind. When he finally reached the turn-off to his own lands, something was wrong. The gate. He remembered it as a broken, sagging thing, half swallowed by ivy. Now it stood straight and true. The ironwork had been scraped clean of rust and repainted a severe, glossy black. The stone posts were upright, the ivy cleared away. It was a small thing, but it was so jarringly, fundamentally different from his memory that he reined in his horse, staring. Perhaps he had taken a wrong turn? But no, this was the Blackwood crest, stark and proud on the gate. He urged his horse on, a strange sense of unease settling over him. The drive was next. It had been a rutted, weed-choked mess. Now it was clear, the gravel raked and level. The overgrown, clawing branches of the ancient trees had been trimmed back, allowing slivers of the gray afternoon light to pierce the canopy. It was tidy, maintained. He rounded the final bend, and the house came into view. Alastair pulled his horse to a dead stop, his breath catching in his throat. He did not recognize it. The monstrous, rotting tooth of his memory was gone. The house was still vast, still imposing, still a creature of dark stone and Gothic severity. But it was alive. The ivy had been stripped from the main facade, revealing the clean, strong lines of the stonework beneath. The dozens of vacant, boarded-up windows were now fitted with glass that gleamed in the watery light. And from 4 chimneys, plumes of pale, gray smoke curled into the sky. It was the most welcoming sight he had ever seen. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had ridden into the wrong life. He nudged his horse forward, his heart pounding with a strange, unnerving mix of confusion and something he could not name. He dismounted in the drive, his boots crunching on the fresh gravel. The great oak door, which he remembered as splintered and gray, was now solid and dark, fitted with a new iron handle. Before he could even reach for it, the door swung open. A young, neatly dressed maidservant stood there. She looked at him with wide, curious eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" "Sir, not your grace." She did not recognize him. "I am the Duke of Blackwood," he said, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. The girl's eyes widened further in shock. "Your grace, forgive me. We were not expecting you." She dropped into a flustered curtsy. From a hall behind her, he heard a sharp, authoritative voice. "Mary? Who is at the door?" And then a figure emerged from the shadows of the hall into the light. It was her, but it was not her. It was not the frail, fading creature he had abandoned in the rain. The woman who stood before him was magnificent. She was dressed in a simple, dark gown, practical and unadorned, but it could not hide the strength in her posture. Her pale skin was luminous in the gray light. Her hair was coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, and her green eyes, clear and startlingly intelligent, met his without a flicker of fear or subservience. She held a leather-bound ledger in one hand, her finger marking her place. There was an ink smudge on her cheek. He stared, utterly bereft of words. His mind struggled to reconcile the image of the dying girl with the poised, powerful woman who now stood before him, the clear mistress of this transformed place. She looked at him, taking in his drenched and mud-spattered state, his haggard, exhausted face. Her expression was perfectly, infuriatingly calm. She showed no shock, no joy, no fear, only a cool, appraising curiosity, as if he were a tradesman who had arrived at an inconvenient hour. He finally found his voice a rough, incredulous croak. "You're alive." A faint, ironic smile touched her lips. It did not reach her eyes. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as river stone. "Do come in. You are letting the cold into my house." "My house." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stepped across the threshold, feeling like an intruder, a ghost in his own home. The hall was clean, the air warm and smelling of beeswax and wood smoke. A fire roared in the great hearth. This was not the tomb he had come home to die in. This was a place that was vibrantly, defiantly alive. And at its center stood a woman he did not know at all. He stood, dripping onto her clean flagstone floor, feeling large and clumsy and utterly out of place. The house he had remembered was an extension of his own internal landscape, neglected, haunted, decaying. This new house was a reflection of her, tidy, warm, pragmatic, and radiating a quiet, unyielding strength. He had come here seeking an ending, and instead, he had stumbled into her beginning. She handed the ledger to the wide-eyed maid. "Mary, please take this to my study, and inform Mrs. Gable that the Duke has arrived. Ask her to prepare the Regent's suite, and send for Mr. Thorne. His Grace's horse will need attending to." Every word was a calm, quiet assertion of her authority. She was not asking. She was commanding. The staff, he noted, looked to her, not to him. Mary scurried off to do her bidding without a moment's hesitation. He was the Duke, the owner, the master. But he was an irrelevance here, a foreign dignitary arriving without an invitation. "The Regent's suite?" he asked, his voice still rough. "That wing has been uninhabitable for 30 years. It is habitable now, she replied simply, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. I had the roof repaired last summer. The income from the north pastures paid for the slates. The north pastures? He had a vague memory of them as a useless, marshy bog. He looked at her, at the utter confidence in her face, and felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. While he had been losing battles in London, she had been here, quietly winning a war against decay he had not even known was being fought. You will want a bath, she continued, her tone practical, as if she were dealing with a strayed dog someone had brought in from the rain. And dry clothes. I'm afraid your wardrobe may no longer be suitable. We have had to be quite ruthless about mold and moths. She did not seem remotely apologetic about having disposed of his belongings. A figure emerged from the back of the hall. It was Gable, the sour-faced housekeeper. But she, too, was transformed. Her rusty black dress was gone, replaced by a crisp, clean gown. Her severe expression was, if not welcoming, at least neutral. She looked at him, then at Alara. Your Grace, she said, dipping her head to Alara. The suite will be ready within the hour. I'll have a fire lit at once. Her acknowledgement of him was a secondary, almost grudging nod. Your Grace. The power dynamic in the room was so clear it was palpable. Gable was her woman. The entire house was her domain. He was the stranger. The disruption. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, Alara said. Then she turned her cool green eyes back to him. If you will follow me, I will show you to the library. You can wait there. I assume you have not eaten. She turned and walked away, expecting him to follow. And he did. He, Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, a man accustomed to leading armies and commanding senates, trailed in the wake of this quiet, determined woman like a chastened schoolboy. The library was not the rotting, mildewed chamber he remembered. The gaping hole in the ceiling was gone, the plaster expertly repaired. The books were off the floor, neatly arranged on shelves that had been cleaned and polished. The air smelled of lemon oil and old paper, not damp. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a comfortable-looking armchair was drawn up before it. Her armchair, he surmised. A half-empty cup of tea and an open book sat on the small table beside it. He had interrupted her evening. Please, she said, gesturing to another chair. Seat. He remained standing, his wet coat dripping onto a surprisingly fine rug. What have you done here? He asked, the question blunt, raw with confusion. I have survived, Your Grace, she answered, her voice even. It is what I do. You, of all people, should not be surprised. You created the conditions for it. There was no anger in her voice, only a statement of fact as cold and hard as the January earth. She was not berating him for abandoning her. She was pointing out the consequences of his actions, as one might point out that fire, when lit, produces heat. He had subjected her to the ultimate trial by ordeal, and she had emerged not just unscathed, but tempered, forged. I expected, he began, but did not know how to finish. I expected you to be dead. The words were monstrous, unthinkable to say out loud, yet they were the truth. I know what you expected, she said, saving him the trouble. The black-edged letter, the quiet, tidy conclusion to our business arrangement. As I said, I apologize for the inconvenience. The dry, cynical understatement of it was more cutting than any tirade. He had no defense. He had acted like a monster, and he could not deny it. He sank into the indicated chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the profound weight of his exhaustion and a new, deeply unsettling shame. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the inconvenience, but the woman. The sheer, indomitable will it must have taken to do all of this, to walk into this ruin and not be consumed by it, but to consume it instead, to bend it to her will, to breathe life back into its stone lungs. How? He finally whispered, the question encompassing everything. The house, the staff, her own transformation. She regarded him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly. One does not repair a ruined house all at once, she said, her voice softer now, more pedagogical. You start with one room. You make it dry. You make it warm. You make it clean. You establish a foothold. Then you secure your supply lines, food, water, fuel. You assess your assets and your liabilities. You cut away the rot. You consolidate your territory. You make practical decisions. You do not waste energy on sentiment. You simply do what must be done day after day. It is not magic, your grace. It is merely work. He listened, mesmerized. She was describing a military campaign, a siege. She had treated her survival as a strategic problem and had solved it with ruthless efficiency. The same kind of thinking he had once applied to battlefields and political chambers. But he had applied his to abstract concepts of power and victory, while she had applied hers to the fundamental, tangible business of living. He, the great Duke, the soldier, the strategist, had been defeated and had come home to crumble with his crumbling house. She, the sickly girl, had faced the same ruin and had conquered it. The irony was so profound it was almost comical. He laughed, a short, harsh, broken sound. It was the first time he had laughed in months, and it held no humor, only a bleak, gut-wrenching self-awareness. Alara watched him, her expression unreadable. She did not mock him. She simply waited. "You," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You are remarkable." It was the first personal thing he had ever said to her. The first acknowledgement of her as anything more than a contractual obligation. She did not blush or preen. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting a fact she had known to be true for a very long time. "I'm a survivor," she repeated. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do. Mrs. Gable will inform you when your bath is ready." And with that, she turned and left him alone in her warm, clean, orderly library, a ghost in the house that was no longer his. He was left to contemplate the ruins of his own life amidst the undeniable evidence of her triumph. The days that followed were a disorienting ballet of polite avoidance. Alistair was an alien presence in the well-oiled machine of the house. He slept in the magnificent, lonely splendor of the Regent's suite, a vast, beautifully restored set of rooms that felt more like a state apartment for a visiting monarch than a bedroom. It was a gilded cage, a testament to her capabilities that only served to emphasize his own irrelevance. He saw her only at meals, which they took in a small, formal dining room she had reclaimed from the dust. The food was simple, hearty, and delicious, grown in her own gardens. The conversation was stilted, painfully civil. She would inquire politely if he had slept well. He would inquire politely about the weather. They were two strangers forced to share a table, the vast, unspoken history of their transaction hanging between them like a ghost. He found himself wandering the house, a restless spirit in his own domain. Everywhere he looked, he saw her hand. The gleaming floors, the mended tapestries, the neatly stacked firewood. He walked out to the walled garden and found Thorne, the groundsman, turning over soil for the spring planting. The man greeted him with a respectful but distant "Your Grace" when he asked about the progress. Thorne spoke of her Grace's plans and her Grace's instructions. Alistair felt a prickle of something he was loath to name. Resentment? Jealousy? He was the Duke of Blackwood. This was his land, his house, his servant. But his title was a hollow thing here. Authority in this place was not inherited. It was earned. And he had earned nothing. She had earned it all. He tried to assert himself. One morning, he went to her study, the room that had once been her sickbed and was now the nerve center of the entire estate. He found her there, bent over a table covered in maps and ledgers, a streak of ink on her nose. "I wish to see the accounts," he announced, his voice louder than intended. She looked up, her expression calm. "Of course, Your Grace. They are all here. This year's and the last. I'm afraid the ones prior to my arrival are in a rather sorry state, but I have done my best to make sense of them." She gestured to a neat stack of books on the corner of the desk. She was not defensive. She was not hiding anything. She was transparent, her confidence absolute. He picked up the top ledger and opened it. He had expected a mess of feminine, nonsensical scribbles. Instead, he found page after page of neat, precise columns, every expenditure noted, every income recorded. It was clearer, more logical, and more brutally honest than any accounting he had ever seen from his highly paid London stewards. He saw the pitiful income from the shepherd's lease, the sale of the silver candlesticks, a note detailing the trade of a case of his father's rotting vintage port for a new plowshare. She had sold off his patrimony, piece by piece, not for fripperies, but for survival, for slates and seeds and bread. He shut the book with a snap. "You sold the Verisdale silver." "I did," she confirmed, her gaze unwavering. "It was either that or sell the leave from the chapel roof. I chose the candlesticks. They were gathering dust. The chapel, I felt, might still have some use." He could not argue with the logic. It was galling, but it was irrefutable. He was a man of strategy, and he recognized a superior strategy when he saw it. He had left her with a bankrupt, sinking ship, and she had kept it afloat by jettisoning the useless cargo. "I will not have you selling any more of the family possessions," he said, falling back on the only thing he had left, his ducal authority. "Very well," she said, her voice mild. "Then I trust you will provide the necessary funds to repair the West Wing granary before the spring rains. The roof is about to collapse, and without it, we will lose half the harvest. I estimate the cost at £50. She had him, and she knew it. His London accounts were frozen, his political credit destroyed. He had come here with little more than the horse he rode. He was a king with no kingdom and no treasury. She, on the other hand, had a working farm, a repaired house, and a loyal staff. She was the one with the real power here. He said nothing. He simply placed the ledger back on the desk and walked out of the room, the scent of his defeat following him down the hall. The weather turned that week. A late winter storm, a final vicious bite before the spring, swept down from the moors. The wind howled like a banshee, and a thick, heavy snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white and isolating them completely. The house, which had felt so warm and secure, now seemed a small, fragile ship in a vast, roaring sea of white. The storm raged for 2 days. Alistair found himself confined, restless, pacing the halls like a caged wolf. Alara, however, seemed unperturbed. She continued with her work, directing the staff, checking their supplies, her calm a steady anchor in the tempest. On the third morning, the wind died down, but the snow continued to fall, thick and silent. Alistair came down for breakfast to find the small dining room empty. Mary, the maid, appeared, her face pale and worried. "Her Grace is not feeling well this morning," she whispered. "She has a cough." A cough. The word sent a jolt of ice through Alistair's veins. He remembered the pathetic, rasping sound in the solicitor's office, the sound of the weakness he had purchased. He went to her study. The room was empty, the fire burning low. He went to her parlor. Empty. A cold dread began to coil in his stomach. He took the stairs 2 at a time and went to her bedroom, a room he had never entered. He knocked softly. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder. Only silence. He pushed the door open. The room was cold. The fire in the hearth had died down to a few sullen embers. Alara was in bed, but she was not sleeping. She was curled into a tight ball under the covers, and her breathing was a shallow, ragged sound. Her face, visible in the gray morning light, was flushed with fever, her skin slick with a sheen of sweat. As he watched, a terrible, body-racking cough seized her, a deep, brutal sound that seemed to tear at her lungs. He rushed to the bedside. "Alara," he said, his voice sharp with a panic that shocked him. He placed a hand on her forehead. She was burning up. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. "Cold," she whispered, her teeth chattering despite the fever. The roof, the granary roof. She was delirious, her mind still fixed on the practical problems of the estate, even as her body was failing her. "To hell with the granary roof," he snarled, a wave of raw, primal fear washing over him. He had seen men die on the battlefield, seen them ravaged by disease and injury. He was not a stranger to death. But the thought of her dying here, now, after everything she had done, was unbearable. It was unacceptable. He turned and strode from the room, bellowing for staff. "Gable! Mary!" Get hot bricks, blankets, and boil water. Now, his voice, the voice of command he had not used in years, echoed through the quiet house. The staff, who had grown accustomed to his quiet, brooding presence, were shocked into action. Mrs. Gable appeared, her face a mask of alarm. "Her Grace," he bit out. "She's ill. The fever is back. She worked too hard," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling slightly. "The storm, the worry over the roof. I told her to rest." "Telling is not enough," Alistair snapped, stripping off his coat. He went to the hearth and, with a ferocious energy, began to build up the fire, using his bare hands to stack the logs. He would not let this room be cold. He would not let the damp and the chill have her. He would burn the whole damn house down for firewood if he had to. For the next 48 hours, he did not leave her side. He became a general fighting a new kind of war, a war against the invisible enemy that was consuming her from within. He marshaled his tiny forces. Mrs. Gable he sent to the still room to brew the herbal remedies Alara herself had taught her to make, feverfew and willow bark tea. Mary and Jane he tasked with keeping a constant supply of hot bricks and warm blankets. He himself became the front line. He sat by her bed, a basin of cool water at his side, and bathed her face and wrists, trying to bring the fever down. He held a cup of water to her cracked lips, coaxing her to drink. When the coughing fits seized her, he propped her up, holding her steady, feeling the terrifying fragility of her body, the violent tremor of her lungs. Section he was the Duke of Blackwood. He had commanded thousands of men, but he had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly helpless. And yet, he had never felt so fiercely protective. This was not a duty. This was not a contractual obligation. This was something else, something raw and desperate and deeply, frighteningly personal. In her delirium, she murmured, not of London society or fine gowns, but of crop rotations and leaking gutters. She fretted about Thorne's bad back, about the cost of seed, about whether Mary was getting enough to eat. Her entire being was woven into the fabric of this place, into the lives of the people who inhabited it. She had built a world here, and even in her fevered state, she was trying to hold it together. He found himself talking to her, his voice low and steady in the quiet, firelit room. He told her stories of his campaigns, not the grand strategies, but the small, practical details, how to ford a river, how to build a temporary shelter, how to find dry firewood in the rain. He spoke to her of survival, the only language he thought she might understand, the only common ground they had. He was trying to reach her, to pull her back from the precipice. "You don't get to die," he murmured, wiping her brow with a cool cloth as the storm raged outside. "You don't get to build all this and then just leave. I forbid it. Do you hear me, Alara? I forbid it." It was the desperate, irrational command of a man who had lost control of everything. He was not a duke giving an order. He was a man, terrified of losing something he had only just begun to realize he could not live without. On the third night, the fever broke. He had dozed off in the chair by her bed, exhausted, and was woken by a change in her breathing. It was no longer ragged and shallow, but slow and deep. He reached out and touched her forehead. It was cool, damp with sweat, but cool. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his entire body slumping with relief, so profound it felt like a physical blow. Her eyes opened. They were clear. The glassy, unfocused look was gone. She looked at him, sitting by her bed, his clothes rumpled, his face shadowed with stubble, his eyes red with exhaustion. "Alistair," she whispered. It was the first time she had used his given name. Her voice was weak, but it was her own. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She looked around the room, at the roaring fire, the neatly stacked blankets, the cup of water on the bedside table. She looked at his hands, raw and scraped from tending the fire. She saw the evidence of his vigil. "You look terrible," she said, a faint, weak smile touching her lips. He let out another shaky breath, this one closer to a laugh. "You're one to talk." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of the wind. The storm had passed. The crisis was over. And in its wake, something new and fragile and strangely intimate had been born. He had been forced into a role he never wanted, that of a caregiver, and in doing so, had discovered a part of himself he never knew existed. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and instead of the disdain he would have once felt for such weakness, he had felt only a fierce, desperate need to protect. The walls between them, the high, cold walls of their transaction, had been breached. The days of her convalescence were quiet and slow. The world outside was a silent, pristine landscape of white, the snow muffling all sound. The house became their entire universe, a warm, fire-lit haven against the cold. Alistair did not return to the lonely grandeur of the regent's suite. He moved into the small dressing room adjoining her bedroom, sleeping on a cot, refusing to leave her side until her strength had fully returned. He found himself in a new, unfamiliar role. He was not the duke, not the soldier, not the politician. He was simply useful. He stoked her fire. He carried her trays. Mrs. Gable would appear with a bowl of rich, steaming broth, and he would be the one to sit by her bed and make sure she ate every spoonful. It was a simple, mindless task, yet he found a strange, grounding satisfaction in it. For the first time in his life, he was taking care of someone other than himself. Alara watched him, her sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. She saw the way his large, capable hands that had once held swords and signed treaties, were surprisingly gentle as he adjusted her pillows. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes and the fierce, protective glare he gave anyone who made too much noise in the hall. He was a bulldog guarding a kitten, a startling and strangely touching sight. Her own defenses, so carefully constructed over the past 2 years, began to soften. She had built her kingdom on the premise of self-reliance. She needed no one, but in the depths of her illness, she had been forced to rely on him, and he had not failed her. He had not been gentle or tender in the conventional sense. He had been fierce, demanding, and utterly determined. He had fought for her life with the same grim tenacity he would have brought to a battlefield. It was a form of care she understood. It was a form of care she could, grudgingly, accept. One afternoon, she was feeling strong enough to sit in the armchair by the fire, wrapped in a mountain of blankets. Alistair sat opposite her, cleaning a piece of horse tack, his hands busy, his presence a quiet, comforting weight in the room. "The account for the granary repair are on the desk," she said, her voice still a little weak. "I was reviewing them before I became a useless invalid." He didn't look up from his work. "The roof can wait. You need to rest." "The roof cannot wait," she countered, a spark of her old fire returning. "If the spring thaw comes quickly, the foundation will flood. The numbers are a mess. I couldn't make them add up." It was a confession of weakness, an admission of failure, however small, something she would never have admitted to him before. He stopped his work and looked at her. He did not offer pity. He did not dismiss her concerns. He responded with the same pragmatism she herself would have used. "Show me," he said. She pointed to the ledger on the small desk. He rose, brought the book and a candle over, and sat on a stool at her feet. "Talk me through it." And so, in the quiet, fire-lit room, with the snow-covered world silent outside, they went over the accounts together. She, with her intimate, hard-won knowledge of the estate's practical needs. He, with his strategist's mind, quickly grasping the complexities of supply chains and labor costs. "You've budgeted for new timber," he pointed out, his finger tracing a line in the ledger. "But Thorne told me there's a stand of seasoned oak in the Westwood, felled by the old Duke for a ship that was never built. It's been sitting there for 40 years. The wood will be as hard as iron." "I didn't know," she admitted. "It wasn't in any of the records." "Some things aren't," he said. "We can use that. It will cut your costs by half." His hand was resting on the open page next to hers. For a moment, his thumb brushed against her fingers. It was not a romantic caress. It was a simple, grounding point of contact, a connection forged over a shared problem. In that moment, they were not Duke and Duchess, not buyer and bought. They were partners. The silence that fell between them after was different. It was no longer a weapon or a wall. It was comfortable, companionable, the silence of two people working toward a common goal. As her strength returned, this new partnership solidified. They began to work together. They would spend hours in her study, which had now become their study, poring over maps of the estate. He had a memory for the land that was as encyclopedic as her memory for the ledgers. This stream, he would say, pointing to a faint blue line on a faded map. It runs dry in the summer, but if you dam it here where the valley narrows, you could create a reservoir, enough to water the gardens and the livestock through a drought. A dam would require stone, she would counter, already calculating the cost. And labor. There's a collapsed quarry on the north slope, he'd reply instantly. Full of cut stone. We have the labor. Thorn and Arthur. And me. The thought of him, the Duke, quarrying stone was so absurd that she almost laughed. But when she looked at his face, she saw he was perfectly serious. The titles and trappings of his old life were falling away, replaced by a focus on the tangible, the practical. The world of London politics was a distant, meaningless dream. This, the stone, the water, the land was real. One day, they walked the lands together, the snow finally beginning to melt under a strengthening sun. He showed her the stand of seasoned oak, the collapsed quarry, the place where the dam could be built. He moved with a purpose and energy she had not seen in him before. The hollowed-out, exhausted man who had arrived in the rain was gone. In his place was a man who had found a new kind of purpose. He was not fighting for power or prestige. He was fighting for this small patch of earth, for this home. They stood on a hillside, looking down at the manor. The stone walls glowed in the late afternoon sun, and the smoke from the chimneys rose in steady, unwavering columns. "You saved it," he said, his voice quiet. "We saved it," she corrected him softly. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw not the haunted soldier or the detached duke, but simply Alistair. A man who was, she realized with a jolt, just as much a survivor as she was. They had both been broken by the world in different ways. And here, in this forgotten, ruined place, they were slowly, pragmatically putting the pieces back together. Not just the house, but themselves. The spring arrived, not as a gentle thaw, but as a sudden, riotous explosion of life. The snow melted, the streams swelled, and the moors, which had been a uniform canvas of white and brown, were suddenly painted with the vibrant green of new growth. The air, which had smelled of cold stone and wood smoke, now carried the rich, damp scent of thawing earth and the promise of renewal. The partnership forged in the quiet of the sickroom moved out into the world. Alistair, true to his word, worked alongside Thorn, his ducal title forgotten. He was a surprisingly capable laborer. His tall, imposing frame, which had seemed so out of place in London drawing rooms, was perfectly suited to the hard, physical work of the land. Alara would watch from the window of her study as he helped Thorn clear stone from the old quarry or dig the foundations for the new dam. His shirt sleeves rolled up, his face and arms smudged with dirt. The sight never failed to send a strange, fluttery sensation through her chest. The staff, who had initially been shocked and confused by this turn of events, quickly grew accustomed to it. The Duke was no longer a ghost or a stranger. He was a part of the working life of the estate. His authority came not from his title, but from the sweat on his brow and the practical knowledge he brought to every task. He and Thorn developed an easy rapport, a mutual respect between two capable men. Alara, for her part, managed the campaign. She organized the supplies, managed the scant budget with a miser's zeal, and planned the work for each day. She was the general. He was her field commander. They would meet in the evenings in the study, tired and smelling of fresh air and honest dirt, to go over their progress and plan the next day's assault on the wilderness. One evening, a crisis arose. A courier arrived, his horse lathered, his face grim. He bore a dispatch from London, sealed with the royal crest. The outside world, which they had both managed to forget, had come calling. The courier was shown into the study, where Alara and Alistair were poring over a planting schedule. The man's eyes widened slightly as he took in the scene. The Duke, dressed in work-worn trousers and a plain linen shirt, his hands calloused and dirty, standing beside his ink-stained Duchess. "Your Grace," the courier said, bowing stiffly to Alastair and handing him the sealed parchment. "An urgent summons from His Majesty." Alastair took the dispatch. The heavy vellum felt alien in his hand, a relic from another life. Alara watched him, her heart sinking. She felt a familiar coldness creep back into her veins, a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The wall she had so carefully allowed to crumble went back up, brick by silent brick. Of course, it was inevitable. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He had duties, obligations. Their winter truce, their spring partnership. It was an interlude, a pleasant fiction. He belonged to that other world, the world of politics and power and kings. He would read the summons, and he would leave. He would ride back to London, and she would be alone again, the mistress of her lonely, functional kingdom. The thought, which once would have been a confirmation of her own strength and independence, now felt like a desolate, unbearable loss. She straightened her spine, her expression becoming cool and formal. She was the Duchess of Blackwood again, a title, not a partner. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace," she said, her voice brittle, "I will see about preparing for your journey." She turned to leave, to give him the space to read his orders and re-enter the world to which he truly belonged. "Alara, wait." His voice stopped her. She turned back, her face a carefully constructed mask of polite indifference. He had not opened the dispatch. He was looking at her, his stormy gray eyes intense, searching. He could see the wall she had thrown up. He could see the retreat in her eyes. "You think I'm going to leave," he said. It was not a question. "You are a duke," she replied, her voice tight. "You have a duty to your king." "I had a duty," he corrected her. "I fulfilled it. I fought his wars. I played his political games. I sacrificed my youth and my peace of mind for his crown. And for what? For betrayal and disgrace. That world is a snake pit, Alara, a gilded cage full of liars." He looked down at the royal seal in his hand, then back up at her. "My duty is no longer to him." Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the hearth, where a low fire was burning against the evening chill. He did not break the seal. He did not read the summons. He simply held the dispatch to the flames. The parchment blackened at the edges, then curled, catching fire. The red wax of the royal seal melted, dripped like a tear of blood, and was consumed. The king's summons, the call of the old world, turned to ash and smoke. Alara stared, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could not breathe. It was an act of treason, an act of rebellion, an act of utter, final rejection. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the firelight. The haunted, exhausted look was gone completely. In its place was a quiet, unshakable certainty. "My duty is here now," he said, his voice low and resonant. "To this land, to this house." He took a step towards her, closing the distance between them. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to encompass the room, the house, the entire world they had built. "My home is here." He looked directly into her eyes, and the final wall around her heart crumbled into dust. "You are my home, Alara." It was not a flowery declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of truth, as solid and real as the stone walls around them. It was the most profound thing anyone had ever said to her. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes. Tears of shock, of relief, of a joy so fierce it was painful. The pragmatic survivor, the woman who never cried, who saw tears as a useless waste of energy, was weeping. She did not try to stop them. He closed the final step between them and gently, tentatively, cupped her face in his large, warm, calloused hands. He wiped away a tear with his thumb. "I have no right to ask anything of you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "After what I did, how I treated you. But I am asking anyway. Let me stay. Let me help you build this life. Let's be partners. In all of it." She didn't answer with words. She couldn't. She simply leaned into his touch, a gesture of surrender and acceptance that was more eloquent than any speech. She rested her forehead against his chest, her hands coming up to grip the rough fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. She could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the sound of home. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was no longer a duke, and she was no longer a bargain. They were two survivors, two broken people who had found in the ruins of a forgotten house a place to become whole. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the firelit study, a permanent fixture against the coming night. Outside, the last of the winter chill was surrendering to the relentless, life-giving promise of the spring. The house around them, and a life within it, was fiercely alive and completely whole.